Oh yeah, well they offered it to me. And, yeah, well, so I said to them, like I said, well, I can stay, and I can do, like, if I'm resident in the UK, I'll take it. Yeah, well, actually, I got I said, well, we can get to the tax no, I was told if you're going to offer it to me, then I'll make it. Yeah. So there's no problem. I think it will be easy though, because
especially with the uncertainty.
Exactly. But I did mention it to me. So that's probably like, okay, if you want to do like, go do half time this, something like that. I guess it also depends on what we do. Obviously for the minutes, not but some of these other projects that we're talking about, it starts to change, but then we just bring more people.
Well, yeah, and then definitely have you ever interacted with university?
So that well, so. Well, I was that's one of the reasons why I think if we get under the umbrella of this, that would really be.
Yeah, it would get their attention. It would make a lot of life much easier. And potentially if it's associated with a partner, we can access to
Exactly. We were thinking. So there's we have a. I don't know whether worth doing, but if this didn't work out, we could try with the education department. But I think this. I'm trying to think of it. Then
yeah.
we suggested divinity faculty, and I was like, well, yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's just that's a really potentially already got some just big refresher like that junior bucket, which does nothing but you, just says
I know. I do that, right?
yeah, I think, well, I suspect this piece of machine is going to
Oh, that's true. No, John. Well, no, they're not. I tell you why. I mean, they're interested in helping, but because of the homeless stuff. So we have to change we need to find somebody who doesn't know anything about that. Right. That's true. Actually, that's true. That's true.
Australia. His first kind of big work was basically on how he's like team trading, which everyone He's really cool. In his inaugural lecture, he featured Boba Fett, which I thought was great. Yeah, he's really cool. I think he's a very natural person. Like, he thinks it's politically
but
Yeah, I mean, I think he's back. I can tell you right now that he and Dave runs on currently don't go to church on me.
oh really? Okay.
What, and then get over from home?
Yeah, I'm cool.
Are you happy for us to do that? I think that's more sensible.
And on the way home?
Take us as a to see
Which not might help you.
Never.
On a boot.
That's not true.
Space.
I don't think that is not true. I don't think.
What do you mean?
That's our point. Like, I'm pretty sure.
I know.
She's right there.
So we'll try.
You
Try.
look at it again.
She,
How have you gone about trying?
we always get really close and really good responses. She's too busy with school.
So this won't be there at school.
Christmas and free drinks. I don't know what you use.
Yeah, have you, like, how much?
I don't know.
What does they get paid slightly less in this kind of?
I did say that when I joined.
Well, it's college.
Oh.
Ridiculous.
Oh, rather than her foundation.
Well, why doesn't the firm pay for these things?
Well, I don't know. It's like,
Why doesn't it?
Yeah, I did. That's
if you
my-
know anyone at the college, right? If you know someone at the college, that possibly has a chance of keeping on the desk.
Children's Day, do you kind of
I don't have to show us it's supposed to be like that. She grew up taking pictures of everyone and also look at her eyes actually.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Peas and already in the level, they just have boiled.
It's almost not. It's follow
We shouldn't be in that.
basically.
So yeah, that's one of the chat. Sorry.
Couldn't agree more
I
about the
would like
chair
to know
thing.
my daughter is going, well, this is
I understand this stuff. So we have see children, how difficult can it be?
That's the problem.
Fridays are not like just one big night, because yes, you're right, because
I just don't have experience.
It's very kind of intense. Just leave that there.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
There's someone from her,
We made an acquisition last week.
gotcha.
Little company called
Okay.
Atlanta, right?
Yeah, for Christmas.
After you moved to Boston, which is crazy. Doesn't it depress you that there are so many really
There's a such a thing as probably.
They're smaller than what?
But go on.
capable and extraordinary, wonderfully gifted people working on, in charge of working on these societal problems, and yet, it's like,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, and I think the extent to which we are now communicated in a like serious way. Some of these issues, I think, probably the generations ago, which we thought totally understood, but we couldn't. It's Cambridge all the time. It'll be here in 10. Yeah, it'll be like 10 or 15.
Did you come up?
No, we live here.
Do you work here?
No. Well,
So I've just finished my PhD at college, and then none of us ever actually leave Cambridge because the world's a big and scary place.
it's true.
It's still here, yeah. And we're here early for Cambridge Don't like coffee or cake.
There's been some big gaps between each day.
You both come down from London? Okay, yeah, that's slightly more irritating if you're here on time. Actually, to be fair.
Are you dressed like you're going to the dinner afterward?
Yes.
Okay.
Are you guys going to the dinner?
I think it's justice.
No,
It's literally just you.
He came straight from work, that's why he's dressed in.
Yeah. Really nice. I mean, have you, or what is one of your?
I'm okay. Yeah, I was here when he had his.
Oh.
I'm so jealous. Which is,
You
I take very personally.
I don't think
very
they just
personally.
like
You must have had a big
He did,
coming.
I think.
when I that he wouldn't.
What did you study?
Social and political science. What's your
Okay.
PhD in?
Social and political science.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, policy, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So which, do you work with Brendan or?
Oh my God, yes, I do.
Okay, he was my director of studies.
Okay, he's
Yeah.
fantastic.
He's
Or no, sorry, you're thinking Brendan Bertram.
Yeah.
Okay,
Which Brendan?
Sims.
The lesson.
Fantastic.
Yeah. No, but Brendan Bertram is also amazing.
I saw David Robinson's Oscar in the press today saying 6-year-olds should vote. Did you see that?
I generally don't have much time for him, so
It
I'm
was like
happy to
his
see
all
him.
paper thing. He was interviewed and said she decided that the only way to fix everything in the UK was to make 6-year-olds vote.
So in fairness, it was taken massively out of context, and he is not an individual I'm like super keen to defend. But the point was more, you can't disenfranchise. You cannot have a democracy and disenfranchise the older generation, but also being super skewed. So that's so it was taken that sort of thing. Like, it was like, so. What's the worst thing about his being? What are you doing with your
I work for the Financial Conduct Authority
Definitely. What is your desk?
Yeah, no, I'm thinking, but what I officially don't want to do is I advise our policy and supervision people that check that things are doing independence do.
Okay, as a lawyer, then
And I write the law, I write the law, and I'm on court classes at the moment doing investigation. Yeah.
So yeah, want to be your
No, it's very relaxing. It's very nice. I've got 3 kids. This is
This is really different to 5:15 on Friday night.
professional way of thinking, having a career and children and seeing them together.
It's just about it. You also usually
You can
It's
take
an
the
overwhelming
next.
American history.
I did a less useful I studied some
Then politics. Politics is next. What did you study? Pardon? Okay.
No, you're like, yeah. Exactly.
Well, I mean, it's not like what you
Well, no. Doing my part to bring about the apocalypse.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yes, I know.
Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, friends, this is a very special event and the college is very much honoured to host this commemoration of the centenary of Nelson Mandela's birth. I think without any doubt the most distinguished of our honorary fellows in recent history, possibly in all our history. Without doubt the person who has most commanded the admiration, inspiration and imagination of people throughout the world. We're here to celebrate a legacy, but also to celebrate the future that legacy has made possible. And the discussion this afternoon will be primarily a celebration of this exceptional man. but in the awareness that the best celebration he would have wanted would have been a forward-looking one, looking at what could be achieved not only in South Africa, but in democratic societies generally. Those democratic societies which just at the moment are in something of a pickle worldwide, and sorely in need of all those things like inspiration, admiration, and imagination, which I mentioned earlier. So my own hope for this discussion is that we will have that forward-looking dimension. When I speak to first-year undergraduates in this college, I like to tell them a little bit about the heroes of the college, among them, of course, Madiba, but also among them that 18th century master, Peter Packard, who was one of the first inspirers of the anti-slavery campaign in this country. Packard was not only a campaigner against slavery, he was a campaigner for an open society. He protested about religious discrimination in the universities of his day. He protested very vocally about popular anti-Semitism in Britain in the mid-18th century. And he certainly protested very effectively about what he called the national crime of the slave trade. In the great scale of things, Packard is not a global figure like Nelson Mandela. But what I think connects the two people is that they knew not only what they didn't want, but something what they wanted. They wanted a society of open discussion, a society of fundamental equality, a society that lived from a sustainable vision. That, as I say, is what I hope we shall be reflecting on together this evening. We have a remarkable panel with us, and I'm very grateful on behalf of the college that all of them agreed to speak. We have our own Professor Saul de Beau, who will be starting the discussion. We have, Her Excellency, the High Commissioner of South Africa, Ms. Nomathembi Tambo, and we're very glad indeed, Your Excellency, that you've been able to join us this evening. We have Professor Christopher Kramer from SOAS, and we also have a number of our own Mandela scholars to talk a little bit about their own experience of the scholarship, Cambridge, or really anything else they want to talk about. So without more ado, I will ask Saul to open the discussion this evening, and I'll ask you to welcome all our speakers.
Well, it's a great honor and a pleasure to be here tonight. I was thrilled to see Her Excellency on the panel, and then suddenly realized that exactly 30 years ago, when in London, I think I almost taught you in an MA class, in Institute of Common Studies, South African lives are always interestingly intertwined. But no life and no couple is more interestingly intertwined than Oliver Tambo with Nelson Mandela. They grew up together, not quite together, they lived, Tambo was born in Bizana, both Eastern Cape origins, grew up, born within a year of each other. They met each other at Fort Hare University, and they were responsible for founding the first black law firm in Johannesburg, well, in South Africa, in the 1950s, a very famous law firm. And in the years of exile, when Tambo went over the border to sustain the ANC in exile, this partnership continued, though they were not again to meet until Mandela was released from the island in 1990, and sadly, Oliver Tambo died, I think, 1995, is that right? 1993. It was an enormously important partnership, a kind of shared sovereignty, and one which was based on trust. The other, I think, key member of that trinity was Walter Sisulu. And I always tell my students that if it was not for Oliver Tambo, Nelson Mandela might not have found an ANC to come back to when he was released. The work that not just Oliver Tambo, but led by Oliver Tambo to sustain the ANC in exile is something which was really quite extraordinary. We can all think of liberation movements that did not survive, and it's a great tribute to his, not just his energy, but his diplomacy and his moral vision. So it's entirely appropriate that you should be with us on the panel tonight to honor the centenary of Mandela's birth. My theme, if there is a theme tonight, is that Mandela's life was a life in education and a life in political education. If you read his autobiography, which is really a Bildungsroman, it is all about how he has learned. And the first, most perhaps, not necessarily most important, but the first moment in his learning process begins when he is taken to the house, the great palace of the Tembu regent, Yonintaba, and taken in. His father, Gadla, has handed him on for tuition, for custodianship, and he forms a great bond with Yonintaba's son, Justice. And they get up to all sorts of bad things like avoiding forced marriages or arranged marriages and escaping to Johannesburg. But what Yonintaba does is instill in the young Mandela at the great palace, the place as well, the principles of African political education. It's that point that Mandela talks about in his autobiography, learning about the way in which consensus, decisions are made through consensus, about the way in which chiefly politics work and the particular connections in that rural part of the Eastern Cape between the chiefly, but still powerful chiefly families and people. Yonintaba also paid for Mandela's education. He goes to 2 missionary schools, Hilltown and Clarkbury, and he writes very movingly about this. One of the interesting things is the relative absence of racism that marks Mandela's early years, and that's largely to do with the fact that the Eastern Cape was thoroughly colonized. There were not that many white people around, and so there was a certain degree of autonomy. And Mandela describes very movingly how in these Methodist Wesleyan mission schools, although they were in many ways very puritanical and somewhat military and certainly very oriented to the British imperial education, Edwardian education, nonetheless, when he goes into the garden of the Reverend Harris and is offered tea by Mrs. Harris, he finds a degree of warmth and connection with his missionary family, which stays with him throughout his life. And he also experiences the joy of working in gardens, and that is something that he is to repeat on Robben Island when he manages to cultivate a garden for himself. And the book that he writes, Prisoner in the Garden, is a tribute to that particular educational formation. After Hilltown and Clarkbury, Mandela goes to Fort Hare, and he describes Fort Hare, which is the first and indeed only really African university, segregated university nonetheless in the Eastern Cape. He goes to Fort Hare. Fort Hare is a nursing home, it's a forcing house for so many of the African elite, not just in South Africa, but throughout Southern Africa. It too has strong mission foundations, Scottish mission foundations, and Mandela goes and enrolls in a BA. And it's interesting, at that time, he encountered Oliver Tambo. If you read their accounts, they have slightly different memories of how they met each other. One says they met at the sporting field, the other one said they met in the middle of the strike. The strike in question was one that Mandela accidentally fell into. One of the interesting things about Mandela's political education is actually that he was rather late in becoming politically active and politically conscious. And by no means at Fort Hare was he the most remarkable person of his generation. He becomes involved in a strike over the provision of food, quality of food. A number of students are expelled, and Mandela stands out in many ways in his own, according to his own view, a rather obstinate way. He ends up being the only person who refuses to accept the deal that is made with the principal car, and as a result he has to leave, and he goes back to Yonintaba, the regent, who is absolutely furious with Mandela for what he sees as a rather trivial protest which he cannot win. And of course he's his benefactor. This is something that Mandela takes into consideration and he thinks about a great deal after that. When Mandela and Justice escaped to Johannesburg, it's 1939, 1940s, the war years, Johannesburg is expanding enormously, and Mandela finds work briefly as a sort of mine policeman. But soon he meets Walter Sisulu, who is an estate agent, expresses his interest in the law. And Mandela then begins his long legal education. And part of that involves going to Witwatersrand University. He enrolls in law in 1943. And this is a very mixed experience. Johannesburg at the time, particularly Wits, is an extremely cosmopolitan place. Although Mandela at this time is a very strong Africanist, very suspicious of non-Africans working in the liberation movement, nonetheless he becomes close and encounters communists and liberals from a wide variety of political traditions, people that he's going to work with very, very closely in the future, including people like Joe Slovo. And this process of Wits is absolutely formative in every possible way. One of his law lecturers, a man called Harlow, and it's interesting that Mandela does not dwell on the fact that Harlow is pretty much a man, he's a great legal scholar, but he's also a racist, who does not believe that law is the right vocation either for Africans or for women. Mandela is the first entrant, black entrant in the Johannesburg Law School, and he clearly struggles, he fails his exams, partly because he's becoming increasingly interested in, drawn into politics. He actually has a series, once he's on the island, to complete his law degree, of tremendous obstacles, and it's finally in 1989, 1 year before his release, that he achieves his LLB from UNISA. And one of the first things Mandela does in one of his kind of great acts of reconciliation is that when he goes to Wits University on a formal occasion, I think he's installed, I can't remember exactly what, perhaps he was installed as Chancellor, he, of his own volition, arranges 50 years after, so this is 1996, a class of 1946. He brings them all together, and he particularly insists on the presence of an Afrikaner lawyer who was a student there. They actually can't find him. And the reason why he does that is explained in his autobiography. This was the young student who, when Mandela arrived once late for lectures, conspicuously moved one seat away when Mandela entered to signal he is absolute disapproval of sitting next to a black man. But Mandela insists on trying to placate this person. They don't do it. So there's another one of the many instances of Mandela's extraordinary capacity to reach out and perhaps not to forgive, and that's an interesting question which I can't dwell on now. Perhaps the greatest period of his education was actually when he was imprisoned on Robben Island from 1962 to 1990. Mandela, in his autobiography, but many other people who give accounts of their time there, refer to Robben Island as a university. And what this refers to is the fact that the political prisoners managed to organize themselves, not just politically in the high organ and so forth, but they effectively create a university syllabus. Some of them are very well schooled and educated, others have very little formal education, it's largely political, and Mandela offers a course on political economy. But perhaps what is most interesting is the education that he gives himself. And there's been some analysis and some interesting new contributions by writers working on this. And many people have commented on the fact that what he learns above all as a prisoner is a tremendous sense of self-control. We should remember that Mandela on the island was only one of the leaders. It's only really, and I would put a date on it, in 1978, that he is acknowledged for all sorts of complicated and interesting reasons which I can't go into tonight, as the leader of the ANC. This is a collective leadership, it's deliberately a collective leadership. But what Mandela manages to do as part of his enormous charisma, part of his great political education, is to separate himself up, to cultivate a sense of enormous self-discipline and restraint. And one of the ways in which we see this is through the literature that was read. For example, Mandela was very clearly taken with a play which they put on with Antigone, in which he plays the role of Creon, but clearly sympathizes with Antigone, and he writes about this later on, and really develops the idea that the law is far more important than justice, and far more important than the state. Other writers have referred quite directly to the idea that Mandela is influenced by Stoicism. We can't be absolutely sure about this. There is some suggestion that Marcus Aurelius' meditations were being circulated in Robben Island, but there are many ways in which we can point to Mandela learning the ideas of Stoicism and actually living them out. And I think this is very much part of the cultivation of his political persona. What we can be sure of is that Shakespeare was very important to Mandela, as Shakespeare was, the global Shakespeare was to many people around the world and on Robben Island. There was a copy of the collected works which circulated. We know that one of the phrases that Mandela came out with in his very famous address in 1964 at the Rivonia trial, he read, I think, the night before, he had a passage in mind, from measure, be absolute for death, for either death or life will be sweeter. And when the collected Shakespeare, when the prisoners after liberation were invited to sign their names against their own favorite passages in the collected Shakespeare, Mandela selected a speech from Julius Caesar, cowards die many times before their deaths, the valiant never taste death but once. Mandela's education and his formal education was very much within an Edwardian and Victorian missionary mold. Missionary education was absolutely key to his early political formation. I know that his favorite poem was Henley's Invictus. But another and even more, perhaps just as important education formation was the idea, his cultivation of political self-discipline. Mandela, who emerged in 1990 and who we remember as the great statesman, and was very different from the Mandela who went into prison in 1962. In 1962-64, he was seen amongst many of his colleagues as, in some ways, certainly he had the charisma, but he was also seen by some as being politically responsible, irresponsible, as not entirely disciplined, and to some people not entirely trustworthy. I don't mean morally trustworthy, but politically so. But the man who came out was certainly not impetuous. And the man who came out was not the man who was imprisoned for leading the armed struggle and for forming, co-forming controversies, where he was someone who symbolized the powers of forgiveness. And one writer in particular concludes or makes a powerful case that this is less part of his Christian sensibility than his Stoicism, namely the view that his own inner strength gave him the means to avoid bitterness and to act according to the precept that one's enemies are not intrinsically evil, but that they can be persuaded to change their minds through persuasion and through reason. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much indeed for that wonderful conspectus of an educational process, a life in education. Lots of reflections that have been started by that on the nature of political education, I think. But now it's time to hear from Her Excellency the High Commissioner. Once again, we're very delighted you're able to be with us, and I'll pass the microphone.
Thank you so much. What I'm going to talk about is Mandela as I knew him, and a little bit probably more about his relationship with my father and the takeaway that I got from the way in which he lived his life. I'll start with the issue around relationships. And I think that what I'd like to say about that is that when I was getting married, I received a letter from Uncle Nelson from Robben Island. This would have been about 1981. And it was quite a remarkable thing. I didn't realize it at the time because I had my mind worrying about wedding dresses and things, but it took 3 months for that letter to reach me, and it had traveled a very zigzag journey around the world to get to Muswell Hill in North London, which means that he had already been thinking about my marriage many months before, probably, and had spent a great deal of time thinking about what he was going to write in that letter. It had to be circumspect, but it had to hit the mark as well. So I would reckon that probably from the time going backwards from my wedding, that letter was probably about 4 months old. And that's the kind of thing that I would like to raise now for all of us here in this fast-paced world in which we find ourselves. He paid a great deal of attention to relationships and to how he conducted himself with other people. The way in which this manifested later when he was out of jail was simply something that he had always done, even from within jail. He cared deeply about people, and that showed through the fact that he remembered everything about people. The letter was a typically chauvinistic African black man's letter, telling me to make sure I was a good wife, and if I didn't think I could, I should move in with my mother for a bit longer, and learn how to cook and make sure that I cleaned, and not to forget the slippers and all that kind of stuff. But it was all done in humour, of course. He would often say to me, you know, your father's not well, and you can count on me. And what he meant was that in the true South African fashion, I didn't just have one father. And he wasn't trying to replace him, but he was trying to say that they were stronger together. And they were stronger together. They were stronger together even though they lived their lives so very far apart. And seeing them reunited for the first time was in South Africa, where the ANC under de Klerk was unbanned for, I don't know why, 3 weeks. And so all the exiles were allowed to go back into the country without fear of being arrested or harassed by the police. And of course, so we all did. And during that period of time, my father met, of course, with his dear old friend, Nelson Mandela, and of course with his other great friend, Walter Sisulu. It was hysterical watching these 3 old men, because they really were old by that stage. My father had already had his stroke, and Uncle Walter was very white-haired. But they acted like young men. They acted the way you would have imagined them to have been when they were young men, testing each other, teasing each other, still being very competitive with each other. And we sat and we just watched them for hours as they went at it, and it was hysterically funny and very moving. They shared something in common though, and I think it was something that was common to their generation, particularly this generation of South Africans, that they were incredibly kind people. They would not just, it wasn't that they'd do anything for you, they wouldn't, but the manner in which they dealt with you was always through the lens of huge respect and compassion and humor. So they were men who were adored because they made everyone feel unique, and they made everyone feel that they were incredibly important. This is something I think we've lost. We're so busy running these days that we barely listen to ourselves, never mind anybody else. And I think it's something that one should remember about Mandela, the icon, that before he became the icon, he was Mandela the man, and he was a man who cared deeply about other people, about their opinions. And another thing that I could say about all 3 of them is that they were incredibly observant. You wouldn't know you were being watched. You wouldn't know that you were being studied. It's something that they all did. And yet one day a comment would be made. Normally it would be something complimentary, but it would be enough to make you understand that you had done something truly good or truly great. And then you would realize, oh, he's been watching me for the last year. I had no idea. And what it did for all of us younger people who were exposed to this kind of observation, I suppose, is it gave us the courage to always strive to be better and to always strive to do a little bit more and to, in a kind of showy off way, I suppose, try to stand apart because we now had got it. Somebody might be watching. And that again takes us back to a typical thing that my mother always used to tell me about living in South Africa within our communities, is that everybody who was older than you was your parent, and they had the right to discipline you, and they had the right to applaud you. And so these old men and old ladies from the liberation struggle, that's what they were to us all, they were parents. So when Uncle Nelson would say to me, you know, I'm always here, I'm your other father, he was reminding me of the history of our people, of the importance of our traditions, as well as trying to comfort me and encourage me with what I had to do and where I wanted to go in my life. His attention to detail would lead him to remember what you wore the last time he saw you and make a comment about the shoes you had on and whether they were safe. And it was just extraordinary, but that sense of understanding how to support people, which is what I take it to be, in fact, without being in their face, without making them feel awkward and embarrassed, is a real gift, but it's not one that is not accessible to all of us. It just takes time, and it just means that we have to be still sometimes. We can't always be running. We can't always be looking down at some screen. Sometimes we just need to sit and watch the grass grow. He had a tremendous sense of humor. They all did, actually. They were all very funny people. And I think what comes across is that his sense of humor was quite self-deprecating, as was my father's, as was Uncle Walter. But when you got them together, they used their sense of humor to almost attack each other. I suppose that's typically male. But they would play practical jokes, and Uncle Nelson was a great one for that. I remember hearing stories of his behavior in Shell House, which was the first ANC office in South Africa, in when would it have been, 1991 or something like that. And he used to play jokes on people, pretending to be other people, and frightening people half to death, coming out with a mop and stuff like that, and shuffling around, and you know, this is what I used to do in prison, and just silly things. But it was all done to make people laugh and to make them understand that don't feel sorry for what has happened, because I can laugh about it. It wasn't that it was fun, but I can laugh about it because they did laugh in prison. I mean, they weren't, you know, suffering every single minute. They made the best of what they had, and they used their humanity and their humor as a weapon, in a way, to stand up and to fight against the system that they found themselves incarcerated in. Uncle Nelson had a way also of terrifying people, not because he ever did anything scary, but because people were so scared of disappointing him that they wanted him to approve of them, always. And I remember once he told me that he was sending one of his great nephews to school at Wits. And he said, look out for him, because he'll probably be there at the same time as I was there. And I found him. And I said, so why are you here? Because you're the laziest person I've ever met. And he says, yeah, no, but Uncle Nelson's promised me that if I come, I'll get an apartment and he'll buy me a car. I just have to complete the degree course. And I said, and he's giving you pocket money as well, isn't he? Oh, yeah, he's giving me pocket money. So the boy went off, and I didn't see him again until exam time. And he was sitting in the same exam room as I was. And I said, right, so good luck. He says, yeah, I'm going to need it. He wasn't prepared, and needless to say, he failed. And he never got the car, and he never got the apartment that he had been looking for. And Uncle Nelson said, well, he's lost a wonderful opportunity. But anyway, I'm still here. So that is the nub of it, isn't it, really? The fact that he had the capacity to, as you so rightly said, not necessarily forgiveness, but acceptance of other people's mistakes, because he would always be there. And so I think I'll close on that. The fact that when one thinks about Mandela, please don't look at that Mandela that, you know, we always see in the newspapers. Just remember the small little things about him that you will have heard from other people telling stories about him, the things that make him relatable to, the things that make him lovable, and the things that can be irritating as with everyone. But anyway, he's always there, and I'm sure he will continue to be an inspiration to many, many generations in the future.
Thank you for a wonderful living evocation of the person rather than just the icon. Thank you too for the reminder that liberation might just have something to do with finding time to attend to oneself and others, as well as the more obvious things, because that's, I think, part of the fabric of our discussion also. Moving on to our third speaker, John Simpson is a name which will be very, very familiar to all of us here, and particularly in this college, of which he is one of our most distinguished alumni. On the occasion of Nelson Mandela receiving his honorary fellowship here, John managed to secure an unexpected interview with the great man, with the full connivance of the college, but without the entire approval of the High Commissioner of the day. That's the story John was just sharing with me. But it's a huge delight to have John back with us here in Magdalene. And I'll hand over to him.
Thank you. Yes, I know it's one of the most sort of hoary cliches of all time. Never meet your heroes. And I only once met a hero that I actually even really liked after a while, and that was Nelson Mandela. It was late, I think, in 1991 or perhaps early 1992, when he'd been released from prison a year or so before, and was living in Soweto, and I made an arrangement to go to see him, having never, of course, I was here at Magdalene when he was jailed, and had never seen him except at a distance when he was released in 1990. And in those days, it was still the apartheid system still kind of operated, even though it was becoming weaker and weaker and feebler. Nevertheless, there was no street lighting in Soweto. Soweto was the biggest city in Africa, but it was utterly dark at night time. And for reasons which may not actually have been anything to do with Soweto, it had no street names. And I arranged to be there at, I think, 7:30, and it was pouring with rain, and I got horribly lost. Not just sort of a little bit lost, but just utterly bereft of any idea of where I might be. And I think I was 2¼ hours late. For, already before he became president, one of the most famous and honored people on earth. And I did think, actually, when I finally found his house, I did think maybe I'll kind of go back home and ring him up and say, sorry, something came up. But then I thought, no, why do that? So I banged on the door. High Commissioner, you said that lovely thing that he, as well as the others, had that ability to make you feel really special. I'd go a bit further, actually. Bill Clinton had the same thing, except that I'm not quite sure how genuine it was. So I banged on the door, rang the bell, can't remember which, and kind of heard movement inside. Then, you know, one of the most famous people on earth was standing in the doorway. I was drenched, humiliated, embarrassed, nervous, terribly nervous. And he just, well, he saw all that. And just the way that he kind of took me in and wasn't interested in my excuses or anything. He was just interested, he seemed to be interested in me, which is not something that I often find among the people that I deal with. And we had a marvelous time, and I like to give the impression to people that he and I became friends, but that ain't true. But I did see him on various occasions over the years, and he always acted as though he did know who you were. But I think that was also part of that marvelous ability of his. And my wife is from South Africa. She's an Afrikaans-speaking girl, and when Mandela came here, which on the day 2nd of May 2001, the absolute height of my career. I mean, I've done various other things in the time, but if I had to pick a day that I was most proud of and happy of, it was reporting on Nelson Mandela's coming to Magdalene and getting his honorary doctorate, something I never believed would happen, actually. Even when the college told me it was going to happen next week, I said, yeah, good luck, you know, I'll be there if it does. And it did. And he arrived in a helicopter, landed in the Fellows Garden, leaving, of course, the helicopter, whatever those things are, you know, the sort of legs it stands on, leaving enormously deep holes in the Fellows Garden. When I was a student, you could get chucked out, or at least you could get punished for walking on the Fellows Garden. Nelson Mandela was able to land in a helicopter, and nobody said anything about it. And there was a group of the master and other people who were here to greet him. And I knew what they felt, because I had felt something of the same thing the first time I met him. He appeared at the door of the helicopter, and they were kind of frozen. I think it was just that sense, you know, is this reality? Are we really here? And so nobody came there, and he said rather plaintively, isn't anybody going to say hello to me? And I was there, standing there with my cameraman and my wife, who was in those days my producer. I gave her a great boot in the back and said, go on, talk to him, because we needed something in terms of the pictures. And she, I don't know how he knew that she spoke Afrikaans, but she tells me that his Afrikaans was absolutely first class and very elegant, she said. And he said to her, what are you doing here? We need people like you to come back to South Africa. She was terribly moved by that, of course. The only trouble is, every time we have a row, she says, I ought to have taken Nelson Mandela. But I mean, you know, we were are still Mandela worshippers, and all I can tell you is that I met him on various occasions, and he was always what you would hope that he would be, and always that sense of acceptance. You're absolutely quite right about that. It's acceptance. That was the quality that he had beyond anything else. So he enriched my life hugely just by touching it in a few moments of time. And I feel that to have just had the honor of seeing him was the greatest thing that happened to me in my entire career.
Once again, a memorably personal and relational account of the person we're here to celebrate. And John, we're very, very grateful that you were able to be here and to share your recollection. And now I turn to Professor Kramer, Professor in the Department of Development Studies at SOAS.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here and my colleagues on the panel. I can't add to the depths of Saul's knowledge or Her Excellency's personal reflections or even John's stories really, but I think, and I wasn't even at Magdalene, I'm terribly sure. Somewhere down the other end of town. I think I only met Madiba once. I was working during the transition for an organization called the Macroeconomic Research Group, MERG, about which more maybe in a moment. But I think the important thing for me was that some of the traits, the principles and characteristics that people have been talking about, this fundamental commitment to non-racialism, this utter openness and lack of bitterness, and this commitment to youth, were things that were shared by a group of people in a generation of leaders. I was working at that time actually for another sometime Muswell Hill resident, Vela Pillay, who was a truly wonderful and very mischievous individual who I adored actually. At times it was not easy for me as a young white economist within this milieu, and there was a particular time when the Communist Party chief Chris Hani was assassinated during the transition, and it was a very delicate moment politically when he was killed. One still wasn't entirely sure which way things would go. And amongst the memorials when he died, there was a massive event in a football stadium, I think, in Soweto. And I was working with MERG, which is part of the democratic movement, worked very closely with the ANC. And for some reason, I was part of a group of people who filed past the open coffin. And each great South African person after another would walk past and go, Amanda. And I thought, my God, what do I do? This was a young white boy from England. So I sort of half-heartedly raised a fist. But what I felt very strongly was completely welcome, and that there was no sense that I was outsiders. That acceptance, because of being involved in the principles of the transition, I think communicated itself to many people. And I think what I'd like to say, there's a slight perhaps elephant in the room, is to take this forward and thinking about where South Africa is now and where higher education is in South Africa now. So there is a very real danger that those principles, those very powerful commitments that Mandela and others shared, they're wobbling, let's say. Earlier you talked about the wobbling democracies around the world. There is a kind of wobbling principles even of struggle, perhaps, within South Africa. And if you see, what did Mandela say? He said that education is the most powerful weapon for changing the world. And the problem is education in South Africa has become not so much the weapon as the battleground, or one of the battlegrounds, for a very, very polarized struggle around where that country is headed. And I think there are serious questions about it. So there were fantastic principles underlying the transition in South Africa. It's questionable now whether that transition has really been a great success in many ways. And I think particularly, I won't bore you with the details of the material economic side, but I think the economic side of the transition has in a way eaten away at some of those principles, and I think it's important that we all bring those back into play and remember those powerful commitments. Maybe we can discuss that more, and I'll just say that for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think it's extremely important that we do, as I said at the beginning, keep looking forward as well as backwards in our discussion here, and think what the possibilities are that this great and remarkable life on any showing opened up for South Africa and indeed more widely for the democratic vision. But before I ask for comments from the audience, we have with us a number of scholars from South Africa. We have in this college for a long time had Mandela studentships. We're trying at the moment to raise money for an increased number of these studentships. We have a very substantial representation of graduate students from South Africa, which we're delighted about at the graduate party at the beginning of term. I kept meeting South Africans wherever I turned, which I'm perfectly happy with, I have to say. So we have, I hope, 3 those with us. We have Lindsay Williams, Tifo Mosanyane, and Menzi Mogalo. And I wonder if I could ask them to say a few words at this stage, beginning with Lindsay.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, Pastor, and of course Her Excellency, the High Commissioner of South Africa. I think our distinguished panel will have to just imagine an amazing presentation behind them as I go. So I'm just going to very briefly speak to you about the opportunities afforded to me as a Mandela Magdalene Scholar here at Magdalene in 2018. Specifically in the context of my studies and what it empowers one to do. So just a brief background about myself. So I was born and raised in Johannesburg, South Africa. I studied a BSc in Chemical Engineering at the University of Cape Town, having graduated in 2014. I then worked briefly as a process engineer in an integrated energy and chemicals company in South Africa called Sasol. South Africans will probably be aware of the name. And then Magdalene kindly awarded me a Mandela Magdalene scholarship to pursue a master's MPhil in advanced chemical engineering. Now, a lot of people ask me, why do I do this degree as one? And I think for me, it's basically to equip myself with the tools to tackle the rapidly evolving chemical engineering landscape. And secondly, to undertake world-class research with a central theme on sustainability, of which Cambridge is renowned. So, I thought I'd take this moment to briefly just describe what chemical engineering is, as some people always ask exactly what it pertains to. So I thought this was a good general definition. Basically, chemical engineering is a discipline influencing numerous areas of technology, and in broad terms, chemical engineers conceive and design processes to produce, transform, and transport materials, basically from lab all the way up to full-scale production. So if anyone asks what is chemical engineering, you now know. And how is it basically evolving? So in a nutshell, there's basically a greater and greater need for more sophisticated products, but more sustainable processes. And often these two do not complement one another. So if I just break this open a bit and try and create a context for my study and its importance for South Africa and beyond. Humanity requires a lot of valuable products. That's what you see on the right-hand side. And unfortunately, to make these products require a lot of resources and energy and utilities, which are all manipulated in a process. And as a result of this process, we unfortunately also create emissions and waste products. Now, as the population grows, the demand for these products, as we would expect, is increasing. But that requires more resources, more energy, and more utilities. So the problem is, as we all know, some of these resources are dwindling, and energy supply is becoming more and more challenging. If I think about South Africa specifically, then electricity is currently a big issue in South Africa in terms of its supply. So my study will delve briefly into a small aspect of this plethora of different problems that need to be solved in the technical landscape. So my course basically looks at process improvement in that black box, understanding and trying to reduce these emissions that we're trying to create, and also trying to understand the interaction between the business and this technology evolution. So this is just as my course structure. It's basically just to show what I'm going to be involved in. It's a two-part course. There's a taught component as well as a research component. The subjects on the right-hand side are what I'm currently involved in, and there will be a full-time research next year starting in March. And if the preferences go my way, then it will be in the process integration space, which may not mean a lot to most of you, but basically it will be around sustainable reaction pathways, which allows you to enhance the selectivity of a process to basically allow us to create more valuable products and less waste and emissions within that process block. So I just thought, since education is about answering questions and providing knowledge, I thought I'd give you some real-world examples of what questions we can actually answer from the knowledge of this degree. So for example, in the space of emissions, which is a major global issue with climate change at the moment, you can ask the question, can we store carbon dioxide underground? Can it be sequestrated? Will it react down there? Will it basically diffuse to the rock and come back to the surface? These all require knowledge from degrees such as this. Secondly, can we manipulate reactions to create products that we actually want, and unwanted byproducts, unwanted waste, reduce waste energy? That's another reaction. The answer to this question is basically, it depends. But yes, in a lot of cases they are. So I thought, just to finish, I thought it's applicable to just give a quote from Nelson Mandela. I thought I wouldn't use the cliched one that we all know him well to use in education. But I think this just shows how important it is, how important education is in creating a platform for future leaders to basically attack these obstacles that we know we're going to face in the future. And yes, thank you for the opportunity to basically try and assist in tackling these obstacles. Thank you.
I'll invite Tifo now. Say a few words.
Excuse my excuse my nervousness. I don't usually speak in front of the master. I like to be sure all protocol observed. I've heard people say that. Anyway, I want to talk about Chobungo, performance by Sikhabile and Susani. But before I go into that, I feel it's appropriate that I give you some background or how this links into Mandela's legacy and why I accepted Professor Hughes' offer to speak before you. So firstly, I was reluctant to come and speak today largely because of the discourses in South Africa right now about Mandela, his legacy, whether these ideals that people mentioned before are actually being implemented, and people who look like me, are they benefiting from it? But then again, I went on like a YouTube binge and found a lot of Mandela's conversations about representation, about challenging certain ideals, and I was like, damn it, I gotta do this. So yeah, anyway. Many of you may be familiar with the removal of the Rhodes statue at UCT. I went to UCT, I did my undergrad in transitional justice, and I'm here now, we made it. But when the statue was being removed, Sikhabile performed what she called Chupungu. Chupungu is a soapstone bird which was looted from Great Zimbabwe and right now lies in Rhodes' estate. The purpose of the performance was to try and layer certain meanings about decolonization, about reimagining South Africa, about talking about responsibility and representation. So as a South African, the first thing I saw when I saw this, I was like, oh, brilliant, a phoenix, like, you know, rise from the ashes. Until it was later explained to me that it's meant to have multiple meanings. So for many Zimbabweans, this talks to dignity, this talks to about repatriation. Chibungu, the name given to the soapstone bird, the meaning of the birds is still unknown, but for many Zimbabweans, many people in the area, they believe that the soul of Zimbabwe will never be whole again until the birds are returned. So for a lot of Zimbabweans, this is a reminder that our colonial histories are intertwined and our futures in many ways are also intertwined, and then, sorry. So for a lot of people, this was a reminder that certain things need to be repatriated, that our futures are linked. Another thing that was really important to me is that in most of her performances, she's veiled. And the reason why she covers her face is because she wants to show that she can be any woman. And the reason for that is a lot of memorializations of women in South Africa are either abstract or they focus on women as these nurturers or carers, and they deliberately ignore women's contributions in the struggles as fighters, as writers, as revolutionaries, as these complicated characters. So she refuses that. She refuses to entrench this ideal. Yeah, there's some more important stuff. So what does this have to do with Mandela? What does this have to do with what I'm doing here? The thing that I took the most from this and why I thought this was super relevant is that legacy is both backward-looking and forward-looking. It's about setting certain ideals and asking ourselves how well do we adhere to these? How well are we following this trajectory? And that's what she was doing here. She was questioning this. And as we stand here, I'm a beneficiary of Mandela's legacy and the kindness of Magdalene. But I'll also be remiss in not mentioning I'm also one of 2 Black South Africans who's in my college. So when we ask ourselves about Mandela's legacy and we ask how well are we doing this, does this room look like South Africa? Do the speakers look like South Africa? Certain questions like that need to be constantly asked, and we need to address these things. So in closing, I'd like to use my platform to shine an issue which is dear to me and the 2 other South Africans in my house. Ngosi's Haven is a I forgot the word, but it's a haven for people who are living and affected by HIV and AIDS, and it faces potential closure because of a bureaucratic nightmare it's found itself into. It's pushed into changing its status to an NPO, but because of certain delays, they haven't been able to get the government funding which they proposed because they haven't been recognized as an NPO. So they can't tap into the previous sources of funding they had because now they don't have that status, but they also cannot receive the government funding they were promised. So they can only get donations. So this is something which is super pressing. Alison and I, she's wearing the teal undershirt. I don't know the name of her, she has her hand up. If you want to talk about this, please can you come find either one of us, and would appreciate any kind of help, whether that's retweeting, whether it's donation, whether it's... Oh, and that's a picture of Nkosi and Utata. So anyway, see you all.
Thank you very much indeed, Tico. Thank you. And now, Menzi.
Greetings to everyone. My name is Menzi Ngalalo. I was born in Banongoma, KwaZulu-Natal, and I grew up in a township called Umlazi, south of Durban. My PhD research focuses on hydrological modeling and the societal demise at Mapungubwe. For those that are not familiar with Mapungubwe, Mapungubwe is found in South Africa. It's a World Heritage Site, basically meaning the hill of the jackal. It consists of 3 co-urban centers, which are, if you look just about here, it consists of 3 sort of major co-urban centers, which are K2, Liokwe, and of course Samaria, which is just about here. I'm going to talk about it later on. And so the core Mapungubwe site sits 3.5 kilometers away from what we call the Shashe-Limpopo confluence. Shashe-Limpopo confluence being the point at which 3 sort of countries meet at one point. And it is believed here that 3.5 kilometers away from here is that the earliest pre-colonial state civilization was formed, known as Mapungubwe, which is dated at about 1000 AD to about 1290 AD. We know this through some of the archaeological evidence that you find in the region. And specifically, its spatial arrangement is significant of the earliest traces of state formation or class distinctions which would have been governed by sacred leadership. And so what you have is here then the evolution of the Mapungubwe landscape, which has been framed within the context of global climatic changes. For example, Tom Huffman looks at the warm medieval epoch, which is dated at 1250 AD. This would be the period associated with warmer and wetter conditions, which would really lead to large-scale farming, larger surpluses, and of course, increase in complexity. However, at about 1290 AD, it begins to decline. This is the period then now which is associated with the Little Ice Age. This is the period associated with cooler and drier conditions, lessened agricultural produce, which would later lead to the subsequent abandonment of this region. And so what you saw then is that these social cultural models that have been used in the past were based on oral traditions and ethnographic accounts without any empirical evidence. And so the lack of paleoclimatic proxies has led to us failing to test some of these models. And so the main aim of this research was then to begin to understand things like the hydrological history of this region. But when you begin to understand this, you begin to refine these past climatic patterns that you see in the past. And then also what you do get in a nutshell is the relationship between humans, their landscape, and of course the wider environment. And so in terms of its sort of conceptual framework, it basically looks at historical ecology, whereby we borrow from landscape archaeology, and of course the geoarchaeological side of everything. And so in terms of the strategy and methods for this research was really driven by computational modeling, whereby I've looked at geographic information systems, and of course I've looked at HECRAS from engineers, and then I've looked at that remote sensing, which is just to understand some of the vegetation patterns that you find in the region. But what you really need to do then, if you have these models, you need to also verify. And what I've done is we've introduced the geoarchaeological approach, whereby we're looking at sediments to sort of try and verify our stuff. And we've looked at soil micromorphology to understand some of these stratigraphic patterns. Are we seeing exactly what's happening on these models in the soils also? But then also to understand things like the geochemistry of the region, but also bringing into these models our current and historical rainfall patterns that we channel onto our models. But lastly, to give it that chronological context was to begin to do things like also dating. And then to speak to you about the hydrological models that I've designed for this region, focusing on the core Mapungubwe site, I've separated those into 3 classes, which are advanced morphometric analysis classes, whereby the blackish parts being the readily flooded or heavily flooded, and then the grayish parts, which is just about here, this is just minimally flooded, and then the whites are none if not any. And if you focus on the core site here, you're seeing that the core site of Mapungubwe sits on that flooded zone. And then when we zoom into Samaria and some other sites, you're seeing that it sits just on the edge of that. And so to begin now to introduce it into a 3D analysis way was to perform a scene on our stuff. And this is what you're basically getting. So from here, you have just one headland, and then the core site of Mapungubwe just about here, it sits on that flooded zone, and then just about here, it sits on that edge, and then you do get these sort of bits and bits river islands forming. But introducing vegetation on top of this, there's a different scenario that happens. You're seeing now that there are 2 sort of headlands here, and then the core site here is really not flooded, and then the other sides here are sitting on that edge, and then you do get these larger gaps of sort of river islands forming in this region. And then when you simulate all of this, this is what you're getting. So what's going to happen on the video is the lower sinks are going to fill up. As soon as they fill up, a torrent will come from here, hit against here, and then all of this flooding is deposited here. That's where currently farmers are taking it for farming and all of that. And so to just basically conclude, I've computed also giving it that mathematical background using aircraft, which is used by engineers to sort of understand flooding in this region. It sits really on top of that, so I'm quite happy that my models gel in with that. And then in conclusion, I'm hoping with introducing these new techniques, I'll be able to actually shed some light on how Mapungubwe would have collapsed. And then to just close the session off, I think in the words of Dr. Nelson Mandela, he says, no country is able to develop unless its citizens are educated. And I'd like to believe that we are the seeds that our Dr. Nelson Mandela, our Dr. Kezana, our Tambo, and the likes of Abu Mama, the mothers of liberation and democracy, Abu Albertina. This is really looking at the diversity here from Professor Saldubo and the likes of Abu Sia. I'm really quite happy that this is the new refined sort of Southern Africa that Utata would have loved to see, and many more. With that said, thank you.
Thank you. I rather think the audience will understand without any difficulty why this college is so keen to continue having Mandela scholars here, and why we want to increase our relation, deepen our relationship, increase our intake and our relationship, because the critical questions that have come in these presentations are just, if you like, the tip of an iceberg. What I think we need in this country to be hearing, what I dare say also South Africa needs to be hearing. As education in its fullest sense advances, we've been reminded, I think, also, that to talk about education is not to talk about something that is immediately, self-evidently obvious in the way it unfolds. There are ways of educating that build in questionable, oppressive, retrograde attitudes. There are ways of educating that are genuinely quarrying for the level of liberating knowledge. There are ways of educating which, as the High Commissioner has, I think, implied, increase anxiety and drivenness and take us further from the selves we can be together. And all these issues, I think, are around as soon as we foreground this question of what education is really going to be. And that's the sort of discussion which I hope a college like this is well able to foster and nourish. But we do have some time for actual conversation now. And so we've got about 15-20 minutes. And if there are issues burning in people's minds to come up with and question at the moment, this is your time to put them in. Please. Over there.
Hasn't the crucial part played by former President de Klerk in the abandonment of apartheid largely been left in the shade by the very charismatic Mandela?
Thank you. Would you like to answer that?
Briefly, no. And I'll tell you what I think. I think that had it not been for certain circumstances coming together at that particular moment in time, de Klerk would never have gone to the stage of saying that, number one, the ANC was going to be unbanned, to let them come back. Number two, that he wanted to see a different face on South Africa. And what brought that different, what brought around the need for that different face is very simply the financial sanctions that were coming in and that were hitting South Africa. It wasn't done as a gesture of nobility, certainly. Sorry, I think my voice is going, but it wasn't a gesture of nobility. It was a good, sensible, sound decision to make in order to protect the business community of South Africa. And I don't think that he has been overshadowed at all. He played his part, Mandela played his part. They have all played their parts, correctly so, in the history of our country, and we've moved on.
In the middle there, please.
Yes, thank you all. My question's for Professor Du. I read your book on scientific racism in South Africa with great interest. And I was wondering, and since on the theme of education and also the legacy of Nelson Mandela, if any of you paid attention to the Times this morning on the front page, St. Edmund's College saw fit to give JRF to what has been described as a genocide. And also to tag on to what former Archbishop was saying, Williams, how do we educate away and sort of, whilst defending academic freedom, what do we do about, say, the return of scientific racism in the guise of sociology, in the guise of economics, and in the guise of behavioral psychology? How would you see, and perhaps also the other panelists would like to comment, how do you, within the academy, how do we deal with that, given that things like apartheid based on that are still limiting?
Well, that's a tough question. I think there are two aspects of this. I haven't studied the JRF at St Edmunds very closely, but I did have a look at this young man's work, and it seemed to me, from what I could see, to be quite uninteresting. He was making a case, from what I saw, based on the sense that scientific race, people who are committed to eugenics and the new eugenics, are no longer allowed to present their views. I mean, that's a case that's been made ever since the UNESCO statements of race in the early 1950s. And I think it probably is true to say that there are dangers, and I think that one of the things we're learning about the political environment at the moment is that abstract notions of academic freedom become very real at times of increasing intolerance, but also at times when we realize that maybe it isn't so smart to try and legislate out of existence the ideas that are better perhaps confronted. And having read this young man's work, or at least some of it, it seems to me to be pretty thin, highly repetitive. Many of the tropes that were in this kind of form of analysis that are very familiar to anyone who's studied the history of scientific racism for a century, let alone in its period of self-pity over the last 70 years, we'll see that I do think it's, in the end, best confronted and allowed to have its space, because otherwise the culture of complaint and the sense of victimization feeds other political discourses, which we see very clearly in places like America and Hungary and whatever, which can be even more dangerous. So it's a very difficult, I don't have a settled view on this. I certainly am not comfortable, and I don't understand why St Edmunds made this decision, whether it was deliberately provocative. Having sat on many JRF committees, or several, I know just how competitive these things are, and it would surprise me, frankly, given the enormous wealth and talent of young students, that this one was the best of all. So I don't understand the politics beneath it, but I think that my instinct is, and I must stress I don't have a settled view, my instinct is that to try and petition this thing away may create more dangers than to take it up and to confront this man. And what is more worrying, and I'm picking up on the piece in today's Guardian about hidden funding from the Koch brothers for these kinds of outfits, and the question of Francis Galton's naming at UCL, that these are complicated issues, but they need to be confronted openly and directly, and I guess that's my instinct. Thank you.
Listen, you want to comment on the general point? I would really just add that, and we, where I work in SOAS, we have an extremely intense political environment, and we're having this kind of conversation on a daily basis. I very much agree with Saul. I think the way to dismiss this is to dismiss it with reason rather than banning and excluding, and it's very upsetting. And I think the problem does come when it's not just an idea, it's weighted with money and power. Yeah. That's the harder thing to confront. I'm not sure I have a brilliant way to do it, but I think starting from a principle of tolerance, openness and reason is about the best we can do.
Thank you. Oh yes, please.
Thank you. How would you assess the present South African government's record in terms of the provision of basic services for the South African people, its record on corruption, and its dealing the acceptance of investment, for instance, from other governments which may not be very ethical, such as those found in East Asia, for instance, but others, including in Africa.
Could you repeat?
Yes. The question about how we would assess the present South African government's record, especially in terms of its acceptance of investment from elsewhere, from East Asia, among other places. I think, Your Excellency,
Just trying to write. You had 3 questions in there. Which one is the most pressing?
Well, they're all pressing, aren't they, really?
Well, which one would you like me to answer?
Well, okay, how about the basic provision of services to South African people?
Okay, this is not a problem that was created by this current government. They found that problem there already. So I think your question should be talking more about what this government is doing, not what it was saddled with from the past. If you want to go into the past, a lot of the problems in terms of service delivery that South Africa is now facing are not new problems. They were there under the apartheid regime. They were created to a large extent by the way in which the apartheid regime handled the black population. So there was always a lack of services. This is not something that has been created since the ANC became the government of the country. It's always been there. I think you might want to consider the fact that we are a country that, you were talking earlier on, Professor, about this transition and how disappointing it's been. We have not finished our transition yet, and I think it would be slightly unfair to say that after 25 years we should have solved problems that a lot of Western countries took centuries to figure out, and quite frankly most of them still haven't managed to do it. So I don't think that we need to worry about the level of service delivery at the moment. The government will do better. I think we need to also admit that very often the good news is not being told. Houses have been built, places that have had no water or electricity over the course of the last 25 years have. Schools have gone up, more hospitals have gone up, but you won't necessarily read about all of these things. You'll hear the bad news. We have got to a stage where we have kids, no matter that our education system is in tatters just about, but we have young people who are here. Cambridge, Magdalene, something's working. And there are many more of them at home who would love the opportunity to be in a place like this. We have many young people who are becoming entrepreneurs. We have people, I'll tell you what's happened as one of the better results of our new democracy is that people's expectation and sense of belief in themselves is increased hugely. And part of that means that their expectations of where they want to be and what they expect from their government is completely different. But we're getting there, and so don't be so quick to judge is what I would suggest.
Yes, I don't want to be a purveyor of what journalists usually are, which is gloom and doom, and you're quite right, there's not enough attention paid to the very genuine advances that are going on, particularly in education in South Africa, and there are some really bright spots. I happen to know a headmistress of a school, a primary school in Soweto, and I get a bit of an insight into the problems of running a school in Soweto from her. One of the big issues that she talks about is the problems of having the South African Democratic Teachers Union, which she maintains is very unreconstructed and causes considerable difficulties, of course associated very closely with the ANC. South Africa actually spends more per capita than any European country, at least I think it's more than any European country, any EU country that is, on education, which is remarkable. I mean, it spends, I think, 1.6 6% more of GDP on education than Britain does, for instance, and Britain is more or less average in the EU, which is remarkable and really important. But the fact is that South Africa comes at the bottom, or very close to the bottom, of every international survey on education. There are big problems. 27% of children who spent 6 years at school in South Africa now find it hard to read or write. The proportion in Tanzania, for instance, is 4%. So there are big issues. One of the things that this headmistress said to me was, why do they tell us an entire year beforehand that the school is going to be inspected? Because every school, of course, can pull itself together in a year and can achieve that. I mean, in Britain, the inspectors tell schools, as I understand it, less than 24 hours ahead of time when they're going to turn up. These it's difficult to know whether these are structural things or whether they are absolutely just minor issues which goodwill and proper spending can deal with. But I'm afraid that at the moment corruption plays a very large part in the South African education system, and it's got to be rooted out. And Nelson Mandela himself talked about this various times and knew about it. So I'm sorry to introduce a sour note when this is really an afternoon or an evening of celebration, but I do feel we do need to set the facts out as well as just celebrate.
Can I just add something very briefly to this, just on education? John Simpson's quite right. The primary problem about education in South Africa, secondary and primary, is not one of resourcing. It is, however, the deep legacy of apartheid, and here I agree entirely with the High Commissioner. If you think of Mandela's educational career, which I tried to sketch out, think about her own father, who studied at St. Peter's and taught at St. Peter's. This was the point just before the introduction of Bantu education by H.F. Verwoerd, whose explicit intention in introducing apartheid education was to prevent, he did massify education, which is interesting. Many more African students went to primary school, but he so perverted the function of education, that is explicitly to design a system where blacks within South Africa would be educated only in order to be able to provide the most menial tasks. That legacy which now goes back 50, 60, 70 years, has never really been redressed. And that is the crucial thing, I believe, which makes South Africa so poor at delivering education. By comparison, for example, not just with Tanzania, but with Zimbabwe, which for all its problems of corruption and state collapse has continued to produce, for the most part, a much better educational system. So in this case, I think that both reflecting on Mandela's career, Tambo's career, and the two comments, I think we can get some insight in the fact that you can't fix problems all that quickly.
Can I just briefly add? I do, and I think my panelists are being too polite. I think the legacy and the history are fundamentally important, but I don't think we should take those to mean that there's not choices, and to question some of the policy choices that have been made. I think some of the record in earlier years, in the past 20 years or so, have been decisions about economic policy that have been driven by a fetishization of macroeconomic conservatism and of the market. And I don't think those have helped in investment in service provision. I think that's what I'd like to say.
Thank you very much, everyone. I think we have time for one more very quick question, right at the back.
Thank you very much. Continuing on the education theme, if I may start by thanking the Mandela scholars who gave so effective presentation. Very inspiring. I think it's fair to say this college and this university
We have this,
South
sorry.
Africa, seeing links with South Africa, not the university in the UK, seeing links with South Africa, and any advice that you've got for those connections with other universities.
Thank you. The question is about other educational institutions in the UK which have developed and functional connections with South Africa. The question is by Commissioner.
Well, Sussex is doing a good job so far. They've got programs in place with South Africa. And I think I received a letter earlier on this week from Sussex University asking me to go down so that they could do a presentation of some of the courses they were going to be doing in South Africa. We also have relationships with Loughborough University, which I'm afraid Mr. Toller would probably be able to give you more information on, because education is happening earlier. But there's so many links, because a lot of them come through the British Council, and they act as a facilitator. Within some of the agreements that have been done between the South African government and the British government, there is education for universities, there is education in terms of film schools and exchanges and programs like that. There isn't much, even in terms of members of the military doing exchanges and South Africans coming to study at military colleges here. It's pretty much across the board and has been for a very long time. What we're trying to do now is we're trying to change the model of scholarship, if I can put it like that. Because what we find is that universities are very generous with scholarships. But when you look at the exchange rate, where we fall down and where we find it very difficult to support our students is that we can't afford for their living expenses and their accommodation. So what happens then is that invariably scholarships will be lost and turned down. If we could find out how to fix that problem, there would be a lot more South Africans coming. And of course the other problem is the visas, which is a huge distraction. The cost is exorbitant. And in a way it becomes exclusionary. So it feels to many of our students that they're not wanted here because the conditions to get here are so onerous. But you know, we keep plodding on, and it'll improve. It'll improve.
Thank you very much. That.
Could I add to that thought that it needs to be a two-way traffic. It's not just a matter of South African students coming to this country and to the welcoming environments that are around, including a lot in Scotland, but partnerships between institutions, those universities and further education colleges in South Africa can be helpful too, so that support can be given, if you like, in situ.
Thank you very much. That's a very good note on which to draw this discussion to a conclusion, I think. The reminder of the challenge we still face in Cambridge in creating the conditions that will make it genuinely more possible for people, and also the reciprocal nature of a relationship we need to develop. I must say, in our thinking here in Magdalene about this, in both respects, these are issues which are very much on the radar, and I hope we can take them further. Recently, in discussions in the Cambridge Trust about overseas grants, we have been looking at exactly this question of how we guarantee funding for provision as well as other things. So, certain urgency about all this, I agree. But it's been, I think you'll agree, a very probing discussion, properly so. And if I can just conclude with a word about one theme which has come up in the exchange here. The very interesting question of intellectual freedom and the very complex issues which have been discussed around that. I was reminded yet again of the principle which some people have expressed as the difficulty of trying to solve by means of law questions that are really issues of culture. That is, you change not so much by regulations, by changing what is the currency of a society. That takes a long time, and certainly as we look at South Africa, we're looking at a context where the wells of culture were for a long time corrupted. Changing a culture is hard work and protracted work. And so, insofar as changing a culture means changing the stories we tell, it means finding good stories to tell. I think this evening we have been reminded of one of the good stories that can be told. That is a life and a witness which did change the paradigm, change the expectations, change the culture, but not, of course, totally, not all at once, and not forever. Because to keep a healthy, just, imaginative, compassionate culture alive needs constant work, constant exchange between different cultures, different contexts. And that, I think, is what we're challenged to recommit ourselves to as we celebrate this centenary. But before I ask you to join me in saying thank you to our panelists, I want also to unite with their names, the names of those who in college have helped to put this event together. And I'm particularly grateful to Dr. Tilda Watson, who organized the exhibition upstairs, and Mr. Osman Al-Zia, who has looked after the IT this evening. I think to be welcomed as we were by these very tangible images and recollections of Madiba upstairs was part of the rather special nature of it. Oh yes, if Tilda and Osman are around to stand up to be thanked. Tilda, Osman here. And thank you to our panelists. There will be refreshments served where we had tea upstairs on my right.